Hi.
We're going to try this and see how it does. Just going to do a quick video, just recap a little bit over Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. This isn't comprehensive. It's certainly not going to be real in-depth, but I do want to talk through a few things on Chapter 5, which is learning. As I said, Chapter 5 does cover learning, and it talks about how when we learn something, it changes our behavior, basically. So, two of the big components in Chapter 5 that you really need to have a good grasp on are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And those two, I'm going to be kind of flipping through my book, so we'll probably be going through things in order if you have your book in front of you and you want to kind of follow along. But classical and operant conditioning both involve association. So association is basically pairing two different things, and if we associate one with the other, it can change how we behave when we're exposed to one or the other. So they are both associative. Classical conditioning, some of you may have heard of a guy named Isaac Pavlov, and he conducted a very famous experiment with his dogs. So when we talk of Pavlov's dogs, we're talking about just the perfect example of classical conditioning. So I'm going to explain the experiment, and then we're going to talk about the components of classical conditioning. So what Pavlov, and I'm just going to summarize, I may not have all the fine details exactly as they are, but basically Pavlov noticed that when he fed his dogs, they salivated, or they drooled. And this is not something that had to be trained in the dogs. They naturally salivated when they were exposed to food or thought they were about to get food. So he realized that they were salivating even just at the thought of getting food. If he went like he was going to feed them, they would start salivating. So what he did in his experiment was he started associating the sound of a bell with the feeding of the dogs. So every time he fed the dogs, he would ring the bell. And he would do that over and over again. And then, instead of feeding them when he rang the bell, he simply rang the bell. And what do you think he noticed? Well, they had been conditioned to associate the sound of the bell with the food. So without the food even being there anymore, they salivated. So he was able to train them to salivate simply at the sound of a bell by pairing the two things, the food, which they naturally salivated at, and the sound of the bell, which was a conditioned stimulus. So in classical conditioning, how you need to remember this is it takes two stimuli, and it puts them together. One is a natural. It happens by nature. It makes us respond a certain way naturally. We don't have to be trained for it. That's the unconditioned stimulus. And our response to that we, and I say we, it could be a dog or a cat or anything, but the response to the unconditioned stimulus that happens by nature without being trained is called the unconditioned response. But when you pair something with that over and over and over again, what you get is what's called a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. So when we're talking about Pavlov and his dog and that experiment, we have the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response is the salivating at the giving of food. Okay, so then the conditioned, or what he calls the conditioned stimulus, is the ringing of the bell. And the conditioned response is also salivating, but it's specifically salivating at the sound of the bell. So you should be able to identify, given a scenario, the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, let's say it this way, the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, and then the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. So, and we abbreviate those just US, UR, CS, and CR. And those are explained on page 169 and 170 if you have the third edition, which I have because it's the one I've scribbled the most in. If you're in the fourth edition, it might be on a little bit of a different page. There are some other terms in here, but I don't want to spend a lot of time going over most of those. I do want to just touch on generalization. And basically, generalization is, you could probably figure it out just by process of elimination, but it's a sound or a stimulus that is similar to the one that they're conditioned to respond to. It's not exact, but it's similar, and they generalize that response to whatever. So, for example, if you were talking about Pavlov and the dogs and the bell, maybe instead of a bell, it was a buzzer. It sounds similar, but it's not exactly the same. But the dogs, if they still salivate, that would be considered a generalized response. One thing that the book talks about is how that some of these things are the understanding of how this process works, how that we associate things, maybe we don't consciously think about how we associate things with our certain responses, but they've been paired over and over again to the point that it's in there. And because we understand how that process works, we can understand, well, maybe someone has a fear of, let's say, clowns. And maybe we don't understand how that started, but we can know that it could have started by an association. They could have been exposed to clowns at the same time they were exposed to something that caused anxiety or fear or some kind of negative emotion. So because of the association, they now have transferred that negative emotion to clowns. There was an experiment, and it's explained on page 173, where, let's see, who was it? Albert. Albert was a baby, and there was an experiment done with little Albert where he was exposed to a white rabbit. And I think in the picture it's not white, or certainly doesn't look white in my book, but from what I've read, it's a white rat, not rabbit, I'm sorry. And in the picture it is a rabbit. But what they would do is they showed him the white rat. Albert was not afraid of it. Didn't bother him at all. But then they showed him the rat, and they made a very loud noise behind him that startled him and made him cry. And then they took the rat away, and then they brought it back out and made the same really loud noise and startled him and made him cry. So after a few times of this, he was associating that loud noise and being startled and afraid with the appearance of the rat. So then guess what? They didn't make the loud noise. They didn't startle him. They took that away, and they only brought out the rat. Well, he was afraid. He cried because he associated that with that feeling or that other stimulus that did instill fear in him. This can be used to break habits. Aversive conditioning, the book says, is a form of treatment that involves repeated pairings of a stimulus with a very unpleasant stimulus. So, for example, an alcoholic, in order to break themselves of their addiction to alcohol, there is a treatment that has them take something that causes them to be incredibly nauseous at any exposure to alcohol. So every time they drink, they would be very nauseous, vomit, to the point that it was so unpleasant that even the thought of alcohol, or maybe not the thought, but the exposure to alcohol without the medicine that made them nauseous, the alcohol itself began to make them nauseous. And that could be used in a very good way, because it could break someone of a severe alcohol dependency. Also, something to note is the placebo effect, and we all know the placebo effect is when we take something that we maybe think is medicine, but it's not. It has no medicinal value, but we are whatever it is we think that it's going to help us with, it actually does, even though it's not medicine. And so that just shows that our internal organs, our systems can be classically trained, classically conditioned, because we have been taught to think that that medicine is going to help, and our bodies actually does respond to that, even though it's not a medicine, it's a placebo. Okay. The big thing in that section of the chapter is classical conditioning. So make sure you focus on that. Make sure you maybe read some scenarios of different examples of classical conditioning and know you can label those parts. So then we're going to move on to operant conditioning. And operant conditioning also is associative. It's still, you still associate things with certain stimulus or behaviors. Operant conditioning is different than classical. It is based on rewards and punishments. So if we think of parenting or any kind of training in general, even of animals, dogs, horses, whatever, we're mainly talking about operant conditioning. So in our vocabulary here, I said rewards and punishments, but we're talking about reinforcements and punishments. So basically here, let's talk about this and make sure you get these solid in your mind. So if you have something, a behavior that is deemed to be positive or good, and you want it to increase or you want it to continue, you reinforce that behavior. So you can do that in one of two ways. You can reinforce it by giving something that the person or animal would want and find as a reward or a reinforcer, and it's going to encourage them to repeat that same behavior. Or you can also reinforce it by taking something away. Now that's where you have to stop and think. So let me give you an example. Let's say you bring home a report card and you make all A's. And a positive reinforcement where you're given something, maybe your parents said, hey, I'm going to give you $20 for every A you bring home on your report card. That's a positive reinforcer because they're giving you something. But a negative reinforcer, they would have to take something away to reinforce it. What could they take away from you that would make you want to continue making A's? Well, do any of you have chores that you do at home or things that you don't want to do? If they took the chores away, if they said, well, you're using your time wisely, you're studying, if you're making A's, we're not going to make you clean the dishes every night or whatever. So they're removing something, but in a way that it's going to be reinforcing your behavior. So anytime that we say positive, we're adding to. Anytime we say negative, we're taking away from. But if it's a reinforcer, it's to make the behavior continue or to increase it. So that's a reinforcer. If we talk about a punishment, it's just the opposite. So that's where you would have some kind of negative behavior that you want to stop or decrease. And the exact thing, if you have a positive punishment, you're going to add something to cause the behavior to stop. If you have a negative punishment, you're going to take something away that still is causing the behavior to stop, or in theory. So let's give an example. Same thing with the report card, only instead of all A's, maybe you bring home a failing grade. Well, if you have a negative punishment, you're taking something away. So we can think of lots of things that your parents, for example, could take away from you to punish you. A negative punishment. They could take away your cell phone. They could take away your video games. They could take away your car keys. They could take away your privileges to do whatever. That's negative. Something that they could add to you. They could fine you. Maybe you have money and for every failing grade they charge you $20 instead of give you $20. actually that would still be taking away, wouldn't it? So let me think of a better idea. It's easier if I think what pops into my mind is more for young children. So when we think of maybe a spanking, that's giving a physical punishment. So that would be a form of positive punishment. So just remember, positive is adding to, negative is taking away from. A reinforcer means you want the behavior to continue. A punishment means you want the behavior to stop. So make sure that you can identify examples of those different things. There are some things about schedules of reinforcement. I'm not going to focus on those. I think most of the things in chapter 5 were simply classical and operant conditioning. I really wanted you to know the terms associated with those two types of learning. Okay, so let's move real quick to chapter 6. And we don't have just a whole lot here, but since we're making a video, we're going to go ahead and cover a little bit here. So chapter 6 is talking about memory. So how, when we learn something, we've learned in chapter 5, but how does it become part of our memory? Well, when we study memory, there's 3 parts to memory. The first part is called encoding, and that's how we take something in. The second part is storage, and that's just what it says is storing it in your mind, putting it there for safekeeping. And then the last part is retrieval. And obviously that's the ability to get it from your mind and use it or bring it out for whatever purpose. So encoding, storage, and retrieval. So when we talk about encoding, there's some terms in here you do need to know, like divided attention. You need to understand that that's when you've got 2 things going on at once or multiple things going on at once. It doesn't mean you're doing them at the same time, because actually you can't multitask in the way some people think. When you multitask or you're dividing your attention, you focus on one thing and then you switch and focus on something else. You're not actually focusing on 2 things at the same time. So that's divided attention. Sustained attention is prolonged attention at one thing or one subject. Levels of processing, the book is really clear about that, whether we process something in a shallow, an intermediate, or a deep way, and it gives the example of the word mom. And basically, if you process the word mom in a shallow way, you're just looking at the letters and the shape of them, and you're just looking at it very much on the surface level. So if you process it in an intermediate way, you're actually reading the word mom, and you understand mom is a noun. Mom, the M-O-M spells mom. That's a word. It's a person. But then at the deepest level of processing, you would actually think, oh, mom, that makes me think about my mom, and you start creating these connections to that word, so that when you're trying to think of it or remember it, you have all these pathways to get to that, to get to that word, or to get to that topic that you have studied or processed in that deep level. So obviously, if you're processing something at a deep level, you're going to have multiple ways of remembering it. Whereas if you just skim through it, if you're shallow or even intermediate, you're going to have a much harder time storing it or retrieving it. Mental imagery, they've done a lot of studies to show that being able to see pictures in your mind of what you're trying to remember actually helps us remember and recall things. And it talks about how waiters or waitresses, one trick that they do, if you've ever been to a restaurant and you've had a waiter take your the order of the whole table and they don't write down anything, one trick that waiters can do is actually imagine or picture that person with that plate of food in front of them, or that person actually eating that food. So it's just creating that mental picture. It helps them hold on to it longer. So when we talk about the second stage, which is storage, memory storage, we have some different types there, and some are very, very quick, like split second, and then some are longer. So the first kind is sensory memory, and that's memory obviously that comes through our senses. So a smell, a sound, a glimpse of something, and those are, like I said, very fleeting, very fast. And one thing that's discussed in here is echoic memory, and that's where you may hear something and you're not really focusing on it, but you do hear it, and then it's gone, and then you do have the ability to recall it slightly after it's disappeared because there's still a slight echo. You can still reach back and hear that just a little bit after it's already gone. That's called echoic memory. Short-term memory. Honestly, before I started teaching this class, my idea of short-term memory was, oh, well, you crammed for the test, you passed the test, but now you forgot it. That was just in your short-term memory. That's not the book definition of short-term memory. The book definition is memory of something that's only retained for 30 seconds or for as long as 30 seconds. So sensory memory is like a fraction of a second or just like that. Short-term memory is only as long as 30 seconds. Working memory, that's another type of memory that's related to short-term memory, but in working memory, you're holding it in your mind and you're doing something with the information. So, for example, if I were to list 5 words and I were to say, without writing anything down, can you alphabetize these words? Plant, frame, dog, animal, boy. Okay, so in your mind, you could repeat those words over and over again while you sort and alphabetize them. You would have to use your working memory for that. When we talk about memory span, they say the amount of things that we can remember is usually, they call it 7 plus or minus 2, depending on the person. So from 5 to 9 items usually is about where our memory is. Chunking is a way that we can increase our memory, and we all do that when we, like if you learn your social security number, you don't learn all 9 digits at once. You learn the first 3, then the middle 2, then the last 4. Phone numbers, same thing. You learn the area code, the first 3, and then the last 4. So that's chunking. Rehearsal, we know. Rehearsal is repeating over and over again. That does help store things in our memory. And then the last is the long-term memory, and that is just what we know it as. It's where memories are retained for a longer period of time. It could be hours, days, years, or for our whole lifetime. I do want to talk a little bit about some of these memory terms that are in your book. So an episodic memory is information where it's all about what's happening. It's an episode in your life. Semantic memory is memory about the world, like just knowledge. So if we talk about implicit, well, that was explicit memory. Explicit memory is going to be facts and things. It's going to be who, what, when, where, that sort of thing. If we talk about implicit memory, that's going to be the how. So procedural memory is an example of implicit, and that's where you remember how to do skills, like riding a bike, or in the book it shows a picture of a woman playing tennis. You remember the procedure for something. How memory is organized, a schema is one way that we organize memory, and basically I think of a schema as the same as a filter. So it says, the definition from the book says, a schema is a pre-existing mental concept or framework that helps people organize and interpret information. So basically whatever organization system we have for understanding things in the world or understanding how things work, that filter is called our schema. And there is a question on your Chapter 6 quiz that discusses schemas. Or it's an example of schema. Let's see. Memory retrieval. Okay, so when we talk about memory retrieval, that's the last step. Remember, we had encoding, storage, and now retrieval. There's different theories or things that we know about when we retrieve information. We're going to go through those just real quick. There's a few that you're going to need to know. One is the serial position effect. And basically that says a person is more likely to remember something at the beginning or at the end. And the two differences are the primacy effect and the recency effect. So the primacy effect would be remembering the first thing from like a list, and the recency effect would be remembering the last thing that a person heard. Just a little note, you've probably heard your English teacher say you need to have a strong conclusion and a strong introduction and a strong conclusion when you write a paper. Well, I think that ties into this, because your teacher is going to remember the first thing about your paper and the last thing about your paper. That's going to be their bulk of their impression of your paper. The middle part is important, but that first and last, it can make or break you. So serial position effect. Retrieval cues, that's basically where you have something you're trying to remember and you attach something to it that makes you remember it in a certain way. Like it's a reminder or a cue for it. The difference between recall and recognition, basically it's just recall is you have to remember it from, it's just out there and you've got to remember it from thin air or just from your memory. Recognition is you do have to remember it, but you don't have to pull it out from nothing. You can recognize it if you see it. So if we're talking about a test, a recall test would be an essay test or a write all you know test. A recognition test would be multiple choice or matching, where you're just recognizing the answers. Autobiographical memories, those obviously are memories about things that happen in our own life. And one of those, an example of that would be the flashbulb memory. And that just says that in really significant events in our lives, we tend to remember them with more detail and more accuracy than just the everyday mundane events. And that's called the flashbulb memory. It's real interesting in the book. If you have some time to read, I would encourage all of you to read about eyewitness testimony and watch the video that I posted in Canvas about. It's an episode of Brain Games. If you've never watched Brain Games, it's real interesting, and Brain Games just about always ties into psychology. So watch that, because it does give some information about eyewitnesses and our memories and how moldable our memories are. Forgetting. Basically if we don't remember something or we don't have it in our memory, it could be because we have had an encoding failure where we didn't put it in properly, or we could have a retrieval failure where it's there but you just can't get it out. So an example the book gives of an encoding failure is a penny. So we've all seen a ton of pennies in our lifetime. But if I were to ask you specifics, if I were to say, okay, well, number one, whose face is on the penny? You probably could all get that. But then if I said, okay, well, Abraham Lincoln, is he facing to the right or is he facing to the left? You'd probably have to think a little bit. And then if I said, well, what is there something written above his head? If there is, what? You might not know that. And if I said, well, is there something written in front of him or behind him? Even though you've seen, who knows, a countless number of pennies in your lifetime, you might not be able to answer those questions because you didn't encode it into your memory. You didn't focus on it and put it in your memory in that encoding process. you might be better at recognizing it if you see it, but just to recall it, it'd probably be difficult for most of us. Decay theory is a theory that basically says our memory gets worse over time. So all those neural pathways for us that we use to remember and retrieve information, those break down through the aging process, and our memory gets worse. Two types of memory that we may not think, or a type of memory we may not think much about being a memory, but it's called prospective memory. And that's where you remember something in the future. That sounds weird, but an example is, like, let's say you're going to town and you need to remember to stop and pick up eggs from the store. So you remind yourself, oh, don't forget to get eggs when you go to the store or when you go to town. So that's a prospective memory where you're reminding yourself of something in the future. Let's see. Section 6 in this chapter gives some good tips and tools for how to keep your memory working properly, how to store things in your memory. So, like, as you're studying for tests or doing your schoolwork, it'd be good and helpful to use some of these tools. They do have a use it or lose it kind of thing. You know, basically when you are aging, if you keep your mind sharp and you do a lot of thinking games and use your brain in a way that keeps it active, you're more likely to have a memory that works better for longer. So staying mentally engaged is important if you want to keep your memory. All right, well, that kind of wraps up all that I wanted to say. I wanted to just recap on chapter 5 and 6. Like I said, it's not comprehensive, so don't think just because if you watch this video that you got it all. You don't have to read the chapter, or you don't have to study anything else. That's not true, but sometimes it does help to have a little bit of audio review or something besides just words on a page. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'm going to hope it will upload, because sometimes uploading videos to Canvas is a pain. It usually takes hours and hours. So hopefully I'll get it out to you pretty soon. And as always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns. I'm available by email, phone, or through Canvas Messenger. All right, I will talk to you guys later.